Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 9th meeting, Professor Bobby Duffy. And you've all seen his bio. You'll find that he's had a lot of experience in the research sector before he went into academe. So that probably has taught him a great deal about finding out what the public thinks. And as you'll have seen in his bio, he is something of an authority on public policy. But what is clear about Bobby is that his thoughts and ideas are always derived from solid foundations. He's not one of these academic free thinkers who's in their own bubble. So I think you can look forward to what you're going to hear tonight about generations, which is a topic that we've touched only once before, and that was, can anyone remember? It was about 7 years ago. You're probably not going to remember. That was Lord David Willetts, who at the time was Minister for Education, but he did not make any political speeches. He just talked about his book on generations. But that is going to be far superseded by what you hear tonight. And I understand from Bobby that there will be some international dimensions and comparisons along the way. And just bear in mind that if you, and I think his talk will lead you into various areas of public policy, but if there are any questions that are burning in your minds, as you know, you can bring those up in the Q&A. The only further thing I want to say is, of course, that the core of the talk is based on this book, The Generation Divide, and Bobby will be signing copies of this at the break with Nantwich Bookshop. So please go and see him there and have a chat and have a signature. And I understand they've reduced the price, and they're also selling, you can also get yourself a little voucher, one of these little, stocking fillers for beloved members of your family you're trying to get interested in books. But first buy his book, of course, before you buy the book token. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Bobby Duffy.
Thank you so much. A lovely introduction. Great to be here to talk about this. I'm going to talk about generations. Does when you're born shape who you are? And if I was trying to sum up the book in one sentence, it would be that generational thinking is an incredibly powerful idea that's been horribly corrupted by terrible myths, stereotypes, and cliches. So when you look at the academic history of generational thinking, it does bring in some of the biggest thinkers in philosophy and sociology that we've ever had. So French philosopher Auguste Comte actually thought that generational difference and change was the key determinant of societal change. So he said things like, we should not hide the fact that our social progress rests essentially upon death, which is not a cheery thought, I realise, for a Thursday evening. But what he meant was we get kind of stuck in our ways when we get past a certain age. So the successive steps of humanity necessarily require a continuous renovation from one generation to the next. So these are really big ideas of life, death, societal progress. So for me, as someone who's studied generations for a couple of decades now, really, it's a real shame that today the type of generational commentary and analysis we get is more things like this. A real headline from a magazine that millennials are killing the napkin industry. And I could fill a whole presentation with just things that millennials are supposed to have killed. This has become a bit of a meme. So if there's any millennials in the audience, you should be ashamed of yourselves for killing lots of things. But it's not just millennials that get picked on. Also, baby boomers get a bad rap, not so much for killing things, but as ruining things. So in this case, ruining everything. Baby boomers ruined everything from this Atlantic article. So all this kind of stereotype and myth, setting one generation against another. And it is a real shame because you can only understand not just the past and today, but also the future if you understand generational change, based on this really simple fact, is that older generations are being replaced, as they die out, are being replaced by younger generations. So this is the proportion of UK adults in each of the different generations over time, and you can see it's just shifting. So if there is something truly different between generations, then that's really important to understand, not just for now, but for the future. And this is where I have to understand my audience before I start insulting individual generations. So we're going to do a quick show of hands for the different generations. So hands up if you're in the pre-war generation, 1945 or before. Great, we've got a good mix of pre-war, pre-war generation.
No, 1939.
Yes, we call it pre-war. It's very good. I can tell the sorts of questions that I'm going to get. We'll come back to definitions and generational boundaries maybe in the questions, but yes, it's just a shorthand. In the US, they call it the silent generation and then the greatest generation, but we don't really use those terms here. So pre-war, we've got a good spread. Baby boomers? Any baby boomers? Whoa! So now I know my audience. So usually what I say in mixed audiences is they're the rich ones. Go and tap them up at the bar later, but I won't say that here. Any Generation X? My generation, the best generation? Yes. Oh, we've got a good showing of Gen X. Any millennials in the room today? Any millennials? Anyone want to pretend to be a millennial? Yeah, very good. And I assume Gen Z is probably similar. Hooray! Yes! Yes, we got Gen Z, nearly a full house. We can just talk trash about millennials then, because there's none in the room. Very good. So the aim of the book is to separate myths and realities about generations, but the way that it does that is through a very simple framework that I think is the main thing, one of the main things I want you to take from the book and this analysis, is that when we look at societal change, there are only three types of change: period, cohort, and life cycle or age effects. And all change is made up of a mix of these, and a lot of our myths and stereotypes are from mixing them up. So period effects are like waves. They're related to events, things that happen. And they can be small things, just like small, fast, relentless waves, but which still form coastlines, or they can be huge things like tsunamis, equivalent to tsunamis, like an economic crisis or a pandemic, those types of things. So they're period effects. Cohort effects are generational effects, and they're more like tides. Think of them as tides. They're slow-moving, relatively predictable, very powerful and hard to divert once you get going. But we also have life cycle effects, which are like currents, which are also incredibly powerful. They affect the weather. They form global weather. And they pull us along certain types of paths. As you go through different stages in your life, you tend to go through a similar sort of pattern as other people have been. But they can shift over time and divert over time. So like I say, all the change is always a blend of those types of things, working differently depending on the issue and the time that we're looking at. But we focus too much on cohort effects. We like to think one generation is very different from another, and that's where these generational labels have become stereotypes that are wrapping in too much, and it's much more complex and interesting and interactive between these different types of effects. So I'm going to try and make I think 4 points in the time. And the first is that these generational stereotypes are fueling a sense of fake generational battles that distract us from other vitally important trends that we're missing as a result of it. And you see it in all sorts of ways. So we're unthinkingly often encouraging generational conflict in all sorts of different ways. So when Time magazine made Greta Thunberg their Person of the Year in 2019, they called her a standard bearer in a generational battle between old and young on climate. The US singer Billie Eilish was more direct than that. She said, hopefully the adults and the old people start listening to us about climate change. Old people are going to die and don't really care if we die, but we don't want to die yet, said Billie. Now, I love Billie Eilish. My 14-year-old daughter loves her much more, but that's quite an extreme representation of what older people's views of young people is, really, on this. But it's quite common. It's seeped into our culture and how we talk about climate change. The problem is it doesn't stack up at all against the evidence. There is no real generational break in concern about the environment. This is the proportion, the book is international, as outlined, and it looks across lots of different countries. This is the proportion of American adults that think the rise in world temperature caused by the greenhouse effect is extremely or very dangerous, split by those 5 social generations that are most commonly talked about. And this is what I do a lot in the book, is look at it over time. So you're not tracking by age, you're tracking by when people were born. And you can see there's a little bit of a gap there. Gen Z, the orange dot, a little bit higher than millennials, a little bit higher than Gen X, but not much in it at all. It's a few percentage points difference between the different generations. Nothing like you would expect from a rhetoric of a generational battle between old and young. And it's even worse than that, because when I look at a lot more detail at the different types of not just attitudes but behavior on climate, and older generations are actually more likely to take action on lots of these things. They're more likely to boycott products for social purpose reasons than younger generations. Partly maybe because they're a bit wealthier and they can make those types of choices. Maybe because you just get a bit grumpier as you get older and you act on those types of things. It's more of a life cycle effect than a generational effect. So this is a real problem, I think, because it's not only is it not true, it's creating a generational division that's self-defeating. We need people to come together on climate change, but we're sending a message that it's only young people that care about climate change, which is a real problem, dividing us unnecessarily on this type of issue, crucial issue. The second example on this kind of theme is culture wars. And culture wars are not down to a new generation of snowflakes or social justice warriors, a particularly unusual group of young people. And it's a slightly different point, this, because what this shows is the evidence shows that the gaps between young and old, there are gaps between young and old on attitudes to race, immigration, gender equality, gender identity, sexuality, etc. There are gaps between old and young. But the crucial point is they're not unusual gaps between old and young today compared to previous eras. In fact, when I look back across decades of data on surveys looking at these types of social attitudes, it's almost like an iron rule that the youngest generation are twice as comfortable with whatever the changing norm is than the oldest generation, and it kind of works across different periods. So in the mid-1980s, if you take that as an example, just an example from the UK, mid-1980s, and you look at an issue like whether women should stay at home and men should go out to work. Back in the mid-1980s, baby boomers were the younger adult generation, and they were about half as likely to agree with that as the pre-war generation, the pre-1945 generation, their parents and grandparents. So they had a very different view on those types of issues, and they were the ones that were thinking more progressively about, actually, that's not the norm, that should not be the norm. But you roll that forward to 2021, now baby boomers are among the oldest adult generations, and you change the issue to something like whether you should be proud or ashamed of the British Empire. And now it's Gen Z who are half as likely to say you should be proud of the British Empire compared to baby boomers. So the issues change, societal issues always change, it's always kind of moving. But the gap between old and young has stayed the same. We're not more divided on these types of issues than social issues than we were before. And one of the really reassuring things, I suppose, for me personally, of spending so much time looking at generations, is you come to realize that that's not just inevitable, because younger generations are socialized with different norms than previous generations, but it's beneficial to society. It's essential to society. There was a group of demographers in Canada in the 1950s who talked about it as a type of demographic metabolism for our societies that prevents us becoming a stagnant pond. If we didn't have this new injection of generations coming in with different ideas, we wouldn't have that sense of change. And if there was no gap between old and young, we've probably stalled as a society and we're not changing enough. So it's actually a sign to look for of a healthy society in many ways. But we've always got this suspicion of young people because of that type of pattern of it always being this gap between old and young and those types of issues. We always think that today's young are uniquely wrong or weird. It's like a constant of history. And you can go to any era, go back to 400 BC and Socrates. in a very, very long diatribe against young people of his day, he said, the children now love luxury, they have bad manners, they show disrespect for elders, love gossip in the place of activity, which could be written today about young people today. In fact, we did a bit quick polling on this, and over half the UK public agree with that exact statement about young people today. But like I say, you can go to any era you like. I like this one. 1771, a letter in the Town and Country magazine calling the young people of that day a race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles, which is such a lovely phrase. And it's more or less a definition of snowflake just 250 years before we had the term snowflake. I think it's true to say that we feel more divided now between young and old. And that's for two main reasons, I would say. There is something about a more fractious media, social media, and politics that's put age much more at the heart of that. And I will say a little bit, I look at this more in the first book on misperceptions, but I'll say a bit more on this now because we've got a big strand of work we're looking at on culture wars in the UK and comparing it with the US and other countries. And there's a couple of patterns here that is really worth emphasizing. This is analysis by Peter Hall, an academic who looked at the political manifestos of 21 Western countries, looking at the main parties in those, all the way back to the 1950s, and then coding the types of promises that were put into the manifestos by the parties, and whether they were economic promises in blue, or cultural promises in yellow. And what this shows is this quite extraordinary switch around where political parties are promising much less on the economy, partly because it's a globalized economy, you've got less control over it, actually not a lot you can say about that, and much more about culture. What type of country do we want to be, issues around immigration and controlling our borders, all of those types of things have gone up hugely. And that is a general shift across Western societies, that we're focusing our politics more on culture. And because of that pattern that we saw before, about young people being more comfortable with changing cultural norms, as soon as you start to put culture at the heart of your politics, you're building in an age divide between old and young. And we see that very much so in the UK in the run-up and aftermath of Brexit. And lots of other things since. And we've had a particularly dramatic focus in the UK on putting culture and culture wars in the heart of our media and political discussion. So we saw this in all sorts of different ways in this study. This is firstly just looking at the use of the term culture wars in UK newspapers over time, back to 1993, and starting with articles that are not referencing the UK. So this is UK newspapers, but talking about culture wars elsewhere, almost entirely in the US, in fact. So this is the number of articles that you would get each year talking about culture wars, mostly about the US, in other countries. And those little triangles little markers are US presidential election years. So you sort of see a little bit of a bump. Every time there's a US election, we start to talk more about culture wars because that comes more to the fore. But then we also looked at articles referencing the UK. And that's the pattern in the UK. Only 21 articles used the terms talking about a culture war in the UK in 2015. And we had 1,500 articles talking about culture wars by 2021. This huge importation of the language and understanding of culture, US-driven type culture wars patterns. But that's been superseded. This is a constantly moving environment. New terms keep coming up, and now cancel culture has come very much to the fore, where the freedom of speech is being curtailed for people. This is the pattern for culture wars that we just saw from the other slide, but this is the pattern for cancel culture that we've got now. This has become the term du jour for talking about division, 3,600 articles about a term that really didn't actually exist at all in our lexicon in 2018, 2017. Brand new. We've got this sort of sense of that. So we're putting these culture wars right at the heart of our media and political discussion. So it's no surprise that there's an increase in awareness of the terms around these types of topics. So this is the public's, whether they've heard a lot, a little, know very little, or never heard of these phrases. Back in 2020, half of the public never even heard of cancel culture. Just 2 years later, that's gone down, that's halved, more or less. And lots of people saying they've heard a lot about cancel culture. Being woke, which is woke is another of those very touchstone type issues that's gone from, again, halving of people who've never heard of it, these big increases in people who are saying that they've heard a lot about it. In the US, there's lots of discussions among academics about whether top-down versus bottom-up is the key dynamic. Is this about people being concerned about cultural change and them pushing for us to talk about it more, or is it because elites in the media and politics are pushing it down on us and putting that in as a frame? The reality is it doesn't really matter. There's a bit of both. It's going in both directions, but how we talk about it in the media and politics is really important. And because it's constantly shifting and developing, it means that things like the meaning of woke is changing in real time as we use it more and more. So this is an interesting one. If someone described you as woke, would you consider it a compliment or an insult? And we're going to do a show of hands again on this, just to see where we are. If someone described you as woke, would you consider it, let's start with a compliment? A good few smatterings of compliment. Would you consider it an insult? More insults. And who doesn't know what it means or doesn't really care? Yeah, really don't care. There's quite a few of those as well. You're very in tune with the public on this. Yeah, I think that perfectly almost matches where we are now. But look how much it's changed over time. There was a lot of people, half of people were like either saying, I don't know what it means, or just saying, I don't know. And then you had about a quarter saying a compliment, a quarter saying an insult back in 2020. But it's been a big increase in insult since. We have changed the meaning of the term for people, and that varies hugely by age. And one of the big dynamics is actually older groups have become much more aware of it and are much more likely to think it's an insult. That's because it is being used more and more as a pejorative in the media when people are using it. So that's one element of it. That is one element of why we've got this sense of generational conflict, is that it's being used, culture is being used much more in our politics as a dividing line. That builds in an age gradient in terms of party and political identity. And then it's being exploited quite a lot in our media discussions about, well, these are the divisions we should be looking at. And that's quite well known and quite well described. But there's another one that I think is much less well understood or noticed. And generational conflict is also related to increased separation between the generations. And I don't think we paid nearly as much attention to this. There's a bit more work on this in the US. There's some academics there who call it we're living through a dangerous experiment in age segregation, is how they talk about some of the patterns that you see in the US, where older people are living much more separately, physically, from younger people. I don't think it's been noticed nearly enough in the UK, but it is a real trend, a very significant trend. You can see that in all sorts of different measures. This is just one. This is the old age dependency ratio using census data. So basically the proportion of retirement age people versus the proportion of working age people by different types of settlement, from small villages all the way through town sizes, all the way up to core cities, which are our biggest cities. And so you see between 1981 and 1991, both censuses then, no difference. You were no more likely to be old or young, living in village, city, whatever. We were all quite mixed up in different types of locations. But since then, we've had this incredible splaying apart, where towns and villages are getting older, and cities and large towns are getting younger to quite big degrees. These are big demographic shifts, and we did some work with the data journalist at the Sunday Times, Tom Calver, and that has continued to the latest census in 2021. These are big demographic shifts that we are seeing, a new separation in physically where we live. And I would argue that there's a second element to this. It's not just physical separation. Our digital lives are becoming more important generally too, as we live much more of our lives online across the population. And we've got a sense that older groups are doing more online, more au fait with technology, using it more. And that is true, but still within the book, if you look at the analysis in the book, still the biggest gaps that I measure between generations are on digital technological use type things. So this is the proportion of French adults using online social networks every day. And you've got huge gaps between the youngest and oldest. So nearly every Gen Z is on social media every day, 9 and 10. Quite a big drop down to millennials, bigger drop down to Gen X, and then low proportions of baby boomers and pre-war generation who are online on each day. So we're doing different things to different intensities on different platforms in this increasingly important aspect of life. And that leads to separation. So separation, in turn, fuels the stereotyping that we see of different generations, these stereotypes that we build up. If you're not in contact with other generations or other groups more generally, you're much more likely to stereotype them and make assumptions about them. And some of that is just good fun. I don't know whether you've seen this Facebook group. It's called a group where we all pretend to be boomers. And it was set up by two 20-year-old American guys who set up the rule where the only rule is you have to post as if you're a baby boomer, which in their terms is you don't understand the rules of social media. That's effectively what they're going for. And it's good fun. You can see lots of things like that. There's lots of capitalized political rants. My grandson forgot to call me on my birthday, thanks Obama, is one of them. There's lots of very disgusting medical queries from people. And then the ones that make me giggle most are the ones where people get the wrong idea about the nature of backgrounds, and they put up very sad messages with laughing emojis behind them, like cry laughing emojis behind them. So it's good fun. It's sort of entertaining. But the interesting thing was, when you see interviews with the people who run this site, they say they have to moderate it really carefully and actively because it quickly turns into more destructive stereotypes about older people, about racism and misogyny and all sorts of other things coming in. So it's actually very actively moderated. It needs to be very actively moderated, even though it's supposed to be light-hearted, etc., which shows you the danger of that kind of stereotyping that comes into that separation. The saddest thing, in some ways, and this is only like half a sentence here, but is a much bigger bit of the book, is not only is that separation leading to stereotyping, it's meaning that we're losing out on the real benefits of intergenerational connection. One of the clearest things that you see in the academic evidence is that intergenerational connection is a huge benefit to both sides, to older groups and to younger groups, in equal measure. There's a guy called Mark Friedman who writes a lot about this in the US and does lots of activities to bring generations together. And he says that every dollar you spend on that, you spend twice because you're getting the benefits up and down the generations in kind of equal measure. So it's not just a tragedy of stereotyping, it's a tragedy of missed opportunities of intergenerational connection, this separation. And it's a real problem. We've kind of drifted into it without really planning it. We did not think that this was going to happen, but it has happened, and now we need to do something about it. The third point, and this is where some of this stereotyping distracts us, and it's in the same theme as David Willett's The Pinch, is that inequality is increasingly generational, and that will increasingly make it intergenerational in the end. And I won't dwell on this, the economics kind of thing of this, because there's lots of evidence out there, and you'll have seen lots of it, but there has been an extraordinary concentration of wealth by generation. If you think the real economic theme of the past 3 or 4 decades has been the increase in private wealth and how much more important that is than income in how well off people feel. The added element to that is it's been concentrated within a particular birth cohort. And you can see that from this US example. This is the share of national wealth owned by each generation by the median cohort's age. So you can look at it at people at the same age point across different generations, which is really important because wealth tends to build up as you get older. But it means that you can compare, for example, Generation X with baby boomers at the same average age of 45 in the US. baby boomers own 42% of the nation's wealth at that average age of 45. Generation X own 15% of the nation's wealth. Baby boomers are just shot away, just through luck of circumstances, being in the right place at the right time. You've got this massive concentration within a particular cohort. But not every baby boomer made it big by any means. That concentration of wealth within that cohort is also then further concentrated within the top third of baby boomers. It's not at all across the piece. So what that means is that that's going to flow down to future generations, to younger generations, but very unevenly. Some people are going to get a lot, some people are going to get nothing. And then that is the big worry in the US, and increasingly going to be the worry here, is that your life chances are increasingly set by where you start in life. Because of this concentration of wealth in a particular cohort, among a particular group within that, it's going to flow down, but very, very unevenly, which is a big worry. And in the UK, just to give a UK example, Britain example, is mirrored in the extraordinary changes in patterns of home ownership across the different generations. So the pre-war generation and the baby boomer generation followed an incredibly similar path in terms of home ownership, both ending up about 8 and 10, owning their own homes. My generation, Generation X, looked like they were going to race up to meet them, going really well until it hit early 2000s. 2002, 2003, huge increase in house prices, then followed by the financial crash, and they were just deflected away from that life course that looked quite set, ending up about 6 and 10. And poor millennials never really got going. It's gone up a bit since then, but it's still about half of millennials, even though they're no longer that young, owning their own home. But it is worse. It's worse than that for the younger generations, because not only do they have this different, more difficult circumstances that they've got to work in terms of wealth generation, they also get blamed for it in many ways. I don't know whether you saw this. It's a couple of years ago now. Kirsty Allsop wrote a piece for the Times where it did spark a Twitter debate, because her advice for young people was basically it's your fault that you can't own your own home because of things like when I bought my first property, going abroad, the EasyJet, coffee, gym, Netflix lifestyle didn't exist, implying that those were the reasons. Nothing to do with the huge increase in house prices and wage stagnation that had been going on for decades. But I'm much more with Mark Zarb, cousin journalist, who said, to be fair to Kirsty Allsop, if you cancelled your Netflix and Pure Gym subscription, instead saved that £40 a month, as long as the housing market doesn't go up at all, then in just 54 years, you will have enough for the deposit on an average house. So this is quite common, blaming the younger generations for change in circumstances that they can do very little about in many ways. So given that context, it's not the fourth and final point, it's not surprise that we're losing faith that things will be better for us, better for our kids than it was for us, which is a real problem. And you can see that in all sorts of ways, this loss of optimism across more developed countries as opposed to more developing countries. So this is an Ipsos question. Ipsos, the survey organization, asked this across 32 countries. To what extent, if at all, do you feel that today's youth will have a better or worse life than their parents, or will it be about the same? And I'm only going to show you the bottom 8 countries. The top 3/4 of it are countries like China, India, where large majorities think the future is going to be better for kids than it was for their parents. So this is the bottom 8, where there's more people who think it's going to be worse than better. So each of those countries, more people now say it's going to be worse for today's kids than it was for their parents, starting with the US, Germany, Spain, UK is here. It goes all the way down, Canada, Japan, Belgium, then France right at the bottom, 13%. To be honest, French are always miserable about the... and this is... in every single measure that you ever get, they were also least optimistic about the future. It's a cultural thing, and if there's any we can talk about that maybe in the Q&A if there's French connected people. They're always bottom, but 13%. But the UK figure, around a quarter of people think it's going to be better. Around a half of people think it's going to be worse, which is a terrible situation when you think about it, and is new. That's the key point here, is we asked the same same question over a number of different years, and back in 2003, before the financial crash, before this sense of decline, those figures were reversed, where you had half of people in the UK thinking it was going to be better for their kids than it was for their parents, and just a quarter thinking it's going to be worse. So that's a new thing and a worry, and a kind of, again, one of the key themes of the book is this is often set up as one generation against the other, but we're so connected up and down the generations that we want our kids to do better than us and our grandkids to do better again, or at least as well, not to slip back. So that sense that there is no better future for the kids and grandkids is a problem for society as a whole, not just for young people. This is not about young versus old. It ends up being about how we all see the future in terms of generational progress. So for the book, it all really boils down to three actions. If you're thinking about public policy or politics or response, I think there is no way around it that we need to have a focus on intergenerational inequality. What is going to happen over the next couple of decades as this money flows down is going to be a key political issue. And things like just admitting that we have a broken housing market, not just for ownership, but for private rented and social rented housing. The whole housing market just is not working for people, and you cannot build a sense of generational progress unless you fix things like that. It's not only about that, but those types of things are really, really important to resolve. We need to rebuild and protect intergenerational connection. We have drifted apart through lack of attention. We did not think in our planning that it was important to think whether we're separating the generations from each other through how we're building our communities, all those types of things. It just happened. When we ask people about that question of do young people live in cities and old people live outside cities, if you ask people that in polling, people will say yes, of course. Young people tend to live in the cities, older people tend to live outside the cities, which is correct. But you also ask, then if you go on to ask them, was that always the case? Has that always been the case in the UK? They will also say yes, when it's actually a brand new trend that we've seen. We've slipped into this view that it's natural to live separately between old and young, when it's actually, in human terms, an incredibly new thing. So we need to rebuild and protect that intergenerational connection in very serious ways. And then the final point is a lot of the problems that we see for generations is our incredible short-term thinking. We have short-term political cycles, short-term news cycles. Everything is very, very short-term. And, in terms of public policy, it's the same sort of problem. We need to try to embed longer-term thinking. And there are a few moves in politics and policy. There's a Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, for example, that's been set up that's supposed to test policy against not just what it's going to do now, but what will it do to future generations. Those types of things are starting to emerge, but we need to embed that sense of longer-term thinking. And I really loved reading about some of the sociologists' work on this in the book. And there's something called the 200-year present, which really makes sense to me when you start to think about how interconnected we are across the generations. So this is a term coined by the sociologist Elise Boulding to describe a way of thinking about the present with a full awareness of both the effects on our past actions, on us now, and our present actions on the future. Trying to encourage that sense of long-term perspective, acknowledging that the past is still with us in its effects, and that today's actions will determine the future. And it's kind of, when I think about my grandparents through to my children, that is going to be a 200-year period that they'll be living through. I will have seen and known people directly that cover that kind of 200-year period when my grandparents were born up to when my kids are likely to die. You've got this huge expanse of direct connection to wanting society to work. But we don't tend to think in those types of terms. We think much more short-term. So, to sum up, from my point of view, generational thinking is vitally important. And it is a real shame that it's been corrupted in this type of way, because when you're born does matter to who you are. It does shape you. All of those points about what the era that you grew up in affects your social attitudes and your economic outcomes are true. And generations do change society. Auguste Comte is correct. That is one of the key determinants of keeping societies fresh. The problem is that most generation analysis that you see is a mixture of fake conflict and more or less horoscopes. It's kind of, these generational labels have become like star signs that ascribe characteristics to vast swathes of the population that are not true. The Wall Street Journal had a look at LinkedIn, analysed the content of LinkedIn, and there's over 400 people on LinkedIn claiming that they're millennial consultants as their job. That is their job. It's supposed to be consulting on a huge swathe of the population that have got incredibly different aims and objectives from their career. And we got to discard that type of thinking, trying to ignore those stereotypes and these people trying to sell you false stories about generations, but try to keep that deeper analysis of why is change happening. Is this a cohort effect, a life cycle effect, or a period effect? But I also realized that I am Generation X, and no one ever talks about us in this generational analysis. It's either Gen Z, millennials being young and crazy, baby boomers ruining everything. No one ever picks on Gen X. I've probably got a more positive view of generational labels than most people. I'm more like Jonathan Walker. He says, I'm neither a millennial nor a boomer. I come from a generation so irrelevant that people can't even be bothered to hate us. Thank you. There it is. Great stuff.
Thank you all for your questions. Just to mention that at the end, if when you've been through the Q&A and you're even more interested in meeting Bobby and getting his book, I believe that Nantwich Bookshop will still be there as we leave. Now, the various sort of questions. Inevitably, when you make a presentation like this to a citizen audience, some of the terminology that you're sort of it's in your DNA by now. Yep. Not for them. In fact, someone they actually use mobile phones, and they've been looking stuff up in the interval. But someone has asked for you to define woke. What do you think because the point being that some people feel they want to know what they're feeling insulted about, I think. And can you sort of, has anyone arrived at a sort of a good potted meaning for woke?
Oh, such an easy question to start with. There is a definition of woke, which comes from US race inequalities, where it literally means being awake to structural inequality, that there is these structures that hold some people back, push other people forward, and you need to be awake to that. So that's where woke comes from. But, I mean, I don't want to take up too much time on the sort of clarifications questions, but it's such a fluid concept that we're pouring all sorts of meanings into it. And I was just saying in the book Q that we've got a new study where we actually ask people, do you identify as woke or anti-woke? Because anti-woke has suddenly appeared as an identity term from nowhere. This didn't exist. The whole concept of anti-woke wasn't even used as a term until about 2019. But now 17% of people identify as anti-woke. Which is you're against all this thing of being awake to these types of things. And then it changes for in different proportions across the population. So it's much higher among men. More men are likely to think that they're anti-woke. But the challenge with it is it's actively used to roll in lots of different issues into it. So its precise academic meaning is completely beside the point in terms of how it is used in political discussions, because all sorts of things, including climate change, is being rolled into this sense of being woke or anti-woke. And one very important definition related to it is culture wars, which does not mean cultural disagreement. Culture wars means being in one tribe or another. All the academic work in the US has explored this a lot. And we always have cultural disagreements. That is not a culture war. Culture war is you're on this side or you're on the other side of almost always a binary. You're either for us or against us. And lots of things getting wrapped up in those identities of woke and anti-woke is my biggest worry for our politics, is if we turn into that tribal identity where you can only be one thing or the other, that leaves no room for compromise between those different groups. And that is why it's, on the one hand, important to understand where the word woke came from and what it actually means, but it's more important to understand where it's going and how it's being used now. And that's the thing to be awake to, I would say, in many ways.
Thank you. Now, a quick one on the stats. I don't want to spend much time on it, but Jill's wondering whether why 1965 is the end of the boomers and 1966 is the start of Gen X. She wonders whether that has any significance, or is it just a statistical convenience?
So baby boomers is the only generation that's got a proper demographic definition to it, because there was a baby boom, and it kind of, the reality is there were two baby booms. There was in the UK, there was an early one and a later one, but they do kind of go up and down in that pattern, so that kind of the baby boom does end in 1965, around that kind of period. Obviously, there is no hard brakes on those types of demographic trends, and it's a process. So people have to decide where to put the line, and that is usually where they put it. But that is based on a demographic reality, unlike, say, Gen X, which the next generation, my generation, is pretty arbitrary where you wanted to draw those lines. The key test is, does it tell you something useful about the population and the differences between the population? But I don't get too hung up on the boundaries of the precise breaks in these types of things, because if you're near the boundary, you're going to have characteristics of either side, if you see what I mean.
Another one from the survey, and that is where Sandy's asking, can you try to define better or worse, as in our children's lives? Do you remember the number of people who think in the different countries their children's lives is going to either be better or worse? So she's wondering whether you can give some sort of definition about that. I mean, we've had other talks here where there might have been, we had talks on well-being versus economic growth and so on. Do you think anyone really has, do you think the respondents have a clear meaning by better and worse?
They will be rolling in all sorts of things, absolutely, into that, where economics will be high in their minds. And we sort of know that because we've asked much more detailed questions about, is this going to be better or worse, or is that going to be better or worse? And things, it's not at all to say that nothing is getting better. Things, if you ask about educational opportunities, the ability to be yourself, the ability to travel, all of those types of things are seen as being better. But the ones that are seen as being worse are obviously the economic ones, climate, and mental health is a huge generational issue, which is a true generational pattern. The increase in mental health disorders is a true generational pattern. So I think that question doesn't define it, but we can tell from how people respond to more precise or broken down questions that it will be a lot of the economic factors and the threat of climate and all of those types of things that will be forming people's views.
I've got a question here that actually is asking, a bit like the woke question, please explain, but it turns into a policy question. So it's from Chris Nibbs. I had to Google cancel culture in the break. He said, and according to Chris, he found a backward step to free speech. So he wonders who should moderate these, what he calls not so positive trends, as there are no long-term thinkers in power. So would you like to give us some thoughts about cancel culture and how it should be dealt with, or do you think there are policies in place yet?
Gosh, there's no simple questions here, is there?
No, that's the price you pay for your dinner.
What is our response on cancel culture? Let me talk about it a little bit in the context of universities, because we've done a lot of work on free speech in universities, and we did surveys of students, surveys of the public on how they perceive the threat to free speech within universities. And what it shows is most people think free speech is well protected in universities. but there's been an increase in the sense of threat that people have, and more recall of high-profile incidents where people have been cancelled in it. But the most telling outcome from that study is we did a press release for it, put it all out into public domain, exactly the same press release, exactly the same data that we're putting out, and the Guardian's lead was, headline from this was, "There's no problem with free speech, it's all fine, look at this finding." The Daily Mail and the Telegraph's headline from this speech was, "Look, a third of students think free speech is under threat and Conservatives can't speak their truth in universities." Completely opposite portrayals of exactly the same data, just not by lying or being incorrect, but just picking the bits of the data that fitted with their story. So in some ways, so the conclusion from that for me is there is an issue with free speech to some degree, but it's made out to be much worse than it actually is. And really, the big lesson is to look for what are the purposes of people pointing to either there being no problem with free speech, be under threat and cancel culture being under threat, or saying that there's a huge problem, because the reality is neither of those, and we're being kind of led down a path either by the Guardian on the one hand, or by the Mail and the Telegraph on the other hand, and neither are an accurate view of the nuance within the public, and that kind of goes to lots of these types of issues, as we only ever hear about the extremes of either side on these types of debates, when most of the public are in the middle or just don't care so much about it. They've got many, many more important things going on in their lives than whether people can't do a talk at a university or whatever it is. So I think that's the lesson to take from those types of findings and those types of debates, is try to understand why we're having that debate at all, rather than who's right or wrong.
We're now going to turn to questions about place and mobility. I mean, there's three here together. I think we can take them together, if you don't mind. So two of them are about place. So Philip Stenning, do you think that in an era of increasing migration and multicultural societies, where you were born may be as significant or even more significant than when you were born in shaping who you are? So he's sort of taking a look at your title and suggesting a rewrite, perhaps, in a gentle way. David writes, is it not the case that where you were born shapes who you are as much as when you were born? So it's the same idea. And Tricia Melling, slightly differently, to what extent is the breakdown in the intergenerational connection due to the younger people moving away for work?
Oh, great question.
And so, I mean, that is slightly different when you may have measured mobility across these various.
Yeah, no, really interesting points.
Okay.
So the first couple are relatively easy in the sense that in the book there's a few lines and sections that say country before cohort, and that reflecting the fact that it's you'll still see much bigger differences across countries than you'll see across cohorts within a country. So country is still hugely important when you're looking globally, and there's lots of examples in the book about how extraordinarily different the same generations are in different countries. And it's incredible things like, only 4% of late 20s adults still live with their parents in countries like Denmark and Sweden. And then it comes to us, it used to be 20%, now it's more like 28% of young people at around 28 years old still living at home with their parents, and it goes up to 50% in places like Italy. So you go from 4% to 50%, incredibly different ways to live among the same generation. So country still comes first. I think the reason there's a global book is we are increasingly interconnected economically and culturally across countries within generations because of the kind of leveling factors of a global economy and the leveling factors of global media, communications media, whether that's social media or otherwise. So there's more interconnections between generations and more similarity, more pressures making them the same, whether that's economically or culturally. But there's still huge variations between countries, so that's absolutely correct. Do look at the country first. On the intergenerational connection, there's some really interesting patterns on that because there's loads of time use survey data that shows that me, as a Gen X parent, spends much more time with my kids, and as they get older, will continue to spend more time with my kids than my parents spent with me. We've got much more active intergenerational connections within the family unit. And that's been shown in lots of different ways, not just in terms of time use, but in terms of how close we feel to our parents, how close our kids feel to us, compared to previous generations. Lots more positivity and connection within the family unit. But it's turned into this kind of beanpole. There's a lot of discussion in the demographers about the beanpole family unit, which is very thin, but very strong. It's like a strong connection, but then much less interconnection to other generations outside that family unit. So yes, even though young people move away from home to go to jobs, we've still got that very strong familial connection, stronger familial connection between the generations than we had in the past. So that's not really the problem. Is economic migration of young people is not really the problem so much as our incredible sorting of young people into one location and older people into another location. And that's incredibly difficult to stop because we've got big things pushing it, like the increase in university attendance by young people. That has brought young people to cities more often. Migration, international migration, has also helped it because international migrants tend to be younger and of child-rearing age and tend to settle in cities and be together. And that creates that self-reinforcing because then you've got young people having more children, and then in turn them having children, and it kind of comes around. So we've got very, very strong demographic and economic pressures pushing us apart, and it's going to take a real effort to turn that round.
Turning back to the surveys, and this is a bit of some drill down questions here, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. John Mottram, how does education impact on the different generational attitudes that you've discovered? And Anil Vagmaria asks, in all your surveys and research, has race or ethnicity been looked at? And if so, have they revealed any differences? And there's another question in here, if I could find it, where one of the members is asking whether the findings are different in developed countries versus developing countries.
Yeah.
You might just like to
comment
on that.
Yeah, all really good points. And there are differences by education and race. And there are very different situations in developed versus developing countries. If we take that bit first, because I'm very careful in the book to mostly be looking at developed countries with some comparisons on developing because the differences are so large. Generations don't mean the same thing in India as they do here because they haven't had that same sort of cultural and economic legacy that you have lots of commonality in other parts of the world. So that is really quite different. Within countries, comparing education and race and ethnicity, there is definitely, those are important, and things like education has become one of the biggest dividing lines in our politics, for example, alongside age. There's lots of debate in the academic work about whether the fact that younger people today are so much more Labour supporters than they were in the past, young people were in the past. And we've got this brand new age gradient to Labour's vote. There's always been an age gradient in the Conservative vote, but strangely there really wasn't an age gradient in Labour's vote up until 2015. That's what it was, very, very mixed, and then it's become this very age-driven vote. And there's lots of debate about whether that's an education or a cohort effect. But is that because we've got many more young people going to university and the socializing effects of that? Or is it because of a broader cohort effect? And again, the reality is it's a bit of both. And it's a similar sort of point on things like race and ethnicity. So one of the most worrying things, I was saying before, we run the World Values Survey in the UK, which is this massive global survey, 110 countries, looking at 290 questions, goes all the way back to 1981. Huge wealth of data. And we're looking at that generationally quite a lot because you can go back to 1981. And one of the most worrying findings in all of that, most of that I'm doing the same sort of thing as I did here in dispelling generational myths and everyone saying, trying to calm people down on how different the younger generations are to older generations. But there's one really worrying finding in that, which is confidence in some institutions, but particularly the police, which is a really new thing that we've seen just with Gen Z, that confidence in the police has gone down in this country. It used to be 87% people said they were confident in the police. It's now 67% across the population. But all the generations are together, from pre-war through to pre-1945 through to millennials. But Gen Z are like 20 percentage points below the rest of them in terms of confidence in the police. And part of that is a race element to it, because it's a much more diverse younger generation, and they have much worse experiences with the police and much more negative attitudes. But it's not only a race element to it, because it is also it's Gen Z who are white as well, and that's partly because they're interconnected. They've obviously got different. They've got a friend group and a direct experience which includes people from different races, much more so than older generations, and they are seeing this themselves. So this is a real worry about, because we police by consent in the UK. We need to have public confidence in order for the police to do their jobs, and we've got a generational break that I don't often see, but it is a mix of when you were born and race driving those types of factors. So like nearly all of these types of things, there's no one, this is the factor. It is a mix between those, but where cohort is important within it.
I want to position two. I want to talk about Gen Z.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you'd like the microphone, I've got lots of questions here, but put your hand up if you'd like the microphone upstairs or downstairs. Do join in. Okay? Right, so about Gen Z, well, I'll position these quite separate questions. Zena and Lib are two students here saying, do you think social media will be the downfall of Gen Z?
Oh, goodness.
And then Jan Ferguson and an unnamed member, they're saying, well, Jan says, I'm a female boomer. When I sit next to a Gen Z boy on a bus, how do I strike up an intergenerational easy chat where we just learn about each other's day? And someone else has said, do baby boomers and the pre-war lot have an obligation to engage positively with Gen Z? So the older ones are asking that question, and the Gen Z members present are asking a different question. So that in itself is interesting.
Yes.
So would you like to give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought you were going in a different direction on intergenerational connection there. So social media downfall of Gen Z. So this is a serious problem, and it's a complicated one. And I've got quite negative views of social media personally in terms of what it does to our public sphere, public square, because the previous book was about misperceptions, and there is definitely an interaction between people's misperceptions and the social media environment. It's really an information environment that we've created, because social media is part of a system with media and politics and other things that kind of create these feedback loops, which are really destructive in many ways, because we know that conflict is clickable. That's kind of, so you get clicks out of conflict and emotion, and that is fed into the system. So when on the misperceptions work, we talk about surveillance is the business model of the internet, but confirmation bias, showing us what we want to see, the things we already believe in, is the currency that it trades in, because they know that if you mix up people's feed and give them things that challenge their thinking, they click away faster than just showing people what they already agree with. So it's literally built into the financial model of social media environment to show you things you already agree with and to rile you up about different sorts of things. So it's kind of, that is a really bad it's a really bad dynamic to have in our information environment. I think the downfall of Gen Z, the sort of qualifier on this, is we're just starting a big piece of work with an Australian organisation called the Origin Institute, which is like leading institute on mental health of young people, and they deliver lots of mental health services as well as studying it academically in Australia. And there's a lot of talk with some very high-profile people saying that that is the cause of the increase in mental health problems among young people, is social media and smartphone use and all those types of things. And you might have seen there was a Times piece this week about a big Oxford study that was questioning whether that is true. And I think that I'm skeptical about the direct link between social media. If we're talking about downfall at an individual level, I'm skeptical that that is the primary cause or the only cause. And it's a real worry for me that we're blaming social media for those mental health effects. Because if we do that, it seems like there's an easy solution to this, as you do things like ban mobile phones in schools and all those types of things, or restrict social media use. And I don't think that will solve the problem, because I think there's lots more going on that is driving that increase in mental health. And the worry is we've got this very human bias that we like to know the cause of things, but we like it to be one cause, ideally, because that makes it easy to someone to blame and some action to take. But it can be the wrong action. So I worry about that. So it depends what you mean, I guess, by downfall. Individual level, not straightforward. Societally, it's a real problem. Striking up and connection, intergenerational connection is such a good question, because it's really tough to do it in that unstructured environment, just striking up a conversation. Maybe I'm a London person and we don't do that very often, so it may be easier in different environments, but the problem is you need to set up the right structures. There's loads and loads of good work on how do you encourage intergenerational contact and positive contact. And it's all around having common purpose. So it's either you've got some sort of common endeavour. So this comes from contact theory, where you know how the characteristics of a positive contact that you need to set up between people. And it's a lot about being equal on a level playing field between the different groups, but also having common purpose, what you're trying to do something together. So I think it's great to have conversations with people, but we need to put in place more of those structures that create the places where people can interact in a positive way and in an ongoing way to build those relationships. So, and I'm just getting out. I don't know how to talk to Gen Z either. So I'm sort of, it's my kids. I have no idea how to strike up a conversation with them.
I tried it, I think it was last year, but we went to visit my wife's, one of her nieces, and there was a son there. He was about 16, 17, and he was working in the theatre in the big city nearby, and he was talking about how he was going to carry on with theatre studies, media studies. That was his passion. And so I thought, well, I've got to try a bit harder, and connect with this Gen Z. And I said, yes, and what do you think about sort of the famous people in the field like Judi Dench? And he said, who is she? And so it left me thinking that actually the part of the problem is that we each have our own histories.
Yep.
And I remember the Goon Show, but I can't expect people from another generation to know it. So I'm wondering whether some of this misconnect is not to do with age and attitude, but it's just totally different experiences. And we haven't got time to share them, even if they're of interest to other people.
So that's exactly the point. That is exactly it. It's not like they're a foreign species or they're much more different from young people were in the past. It is all about, exactly as you say, it's the cultural reference points that you've got are different. And that is what makes generations different, as we grew up in different environments. And our formative years, one of the most evidenced conclusions is that our formative years are really important in shaping our values and attitudes and behaviours for the long term. That is true. So you grew up at a different time, that you'll have reference points that are different. That doesn't mean to say you can't bridge those divides at all. And there's, again, like I say, I've got to keep hold of lots of those positive examples where there's brilliant examples of intergenerational connection being created. Because it isn't foreign species trying to interact with each other. There are, but it is difficult if you haven't got the reference points, and that's where that common purpose, doing something together, and that can be very organized things like that Mark Friedman guy who does this stuff in the US. They set up this 1 million-person volunteer force in the US that did had older people reading with kids in schools, in underprivileged schools in the US, and it was a huge success in terms of its impact on both sides. So we need those types of structures as well as the casual interactions.
Housing policy.
Yeah.
So I've got two aspects to this. One's a foreign one. Jeff Tucker, on the issue of data, and you're the man with the data that should influence policy. He wonders to what extent there is practical policy engagement by politicians on the housing policy, especially to address the issues and to challenge vested interests. So you might like to answer that. Well, Sally Richardson says, I may be wrong, but I didn't see any data from Scandinavia. That's, by the way. Aarhus in Denmark, where I have family, have an apartment blocks where 50% have to be let to a mix of young and to encourage a generational mix. So there's an example of a policy that appears to be there
I didn't know
around. So would you like to comment on this country's lack of a policy, perhaps, and whether other countries can teach us anything?
Yeah, no, I didn't know that about Denmark.
That's politicians who are at fault here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, but it's really tough because we've got such a vested interest in house prices, because that is such an important factor in how homeowners feel about. So collapsing house prices is not good for national sentiment, definitely, and you can see how much is put into propping up house prices when we had economic crisis and supporting those, because it is it's become such a overburdening aspect of our national wealth that it's really difficult to row back from that once you're in it. So this is a difficult situation, but that doesn't mean to say it's an impossible situation. And I have been really disappointed at the extent of engagement on seeing housing as an interconnected issue, where it is not just about house prices and home ownership and building, but it is also about private sector housing regulation or inventive things like that Denmark example, or social housing. You know, our social housing building just stopped, and we have just not kept up with that level of demand that we can see. So it's no longer. It's interesting. We did a survey for a parliamentary group on inclusive growth, and we were asking people about different policy solutions for inequality. And under the housing ones, we had regulating private renting, more social housing or support for home ownership. And the younger generations just did not pick social housing because it's kind of dropped out of their thinking that social housing is even an option for people now. It's just not in people's thinking that the council or housing associations is going to increase their supply of social housing. So I think it needs to be connected. All of those things need to be connected. And Labour as a opposition have probably got more space in which they could do that, but they're not saying very much on it at all. And it is partly vested interests. Housing lobby is very big. It is true we need to build more housing, and people don't want it near them for good reasons. And again, I don't want to go on too long about this, but it is a passion for mine. But we did lots of work on why people don't want housing built near them, and a lot of it is incredibly rational reasoning about you will not build the infrastructure that is going to support this housing, whether that's roads or schools or other kind of transport things, because people have seen it in the past. This infrastructure has been promised and then not delivered, or the housing is built and the infrastructure comes 5 years later. when people have had to live with not enough infrastructure. So it's not an irrational thing to say, actually, I'm not sure I do want loads more housing near me. It's because we haven't planned it and delivered it very well. So long story short is, yes, it is a political problem, difficult one. It shouldn't be as insurmountable as it's being made out to be, I don't think.
Another political topic here is, I think it was in the press recently, was inheritance tax. Doesn't disappear very often, does it? It usually comes back. So Rod Mitchell goes straight for it. So should we increase or decrease inheritance tax? Brendan wonders whether you believe there should be a public policy position on inheritance tax, and he wonders whether other countries have got such an approach. And is there a policy that goes beyond, I would say, ask you, is whether it goes beyond applying a percentage?
It goes beyond what?
Well, does it? I mean, is a policy more than saying inheritance tax will be
go up
10%, 20%, 30%?
Yeah, I mean, it is such a difficult issue because we've had really bad political discussions about it before, which puts people off, and it's got that immediate trigger that we don't want to talk about that. And you can understand why. We've got really strong human motivation to pass on anything that we can to our children, and that's kind of like, that is very incredibly natural. I mean, but I do think we are going to have to engage with wealth taxation generally in the country because of this increase in private wealth and then its concentration among particular groups. That doesn't necessarily mean it's about inheritance tax, which does affect small numbers of people and raises small amounts of money compared to other bits. But it's much more about wealth taxation overall, which again is such a difficult thing for us to engage with. Again, and not stupidly, it's not stupid that it's difficult because so much of that wealth is tied up in things like housing for people. And so much of it, again, as I was talking in the book queue, is people trying to hedge against the future where they may have to be paying for their own care. So taking that wealth away from people when they're trying to, where they've got a great deal of uncertainty about what it's going to cost for their care, if and when they get to that sort of stage, is again a very rational motivation. But we've been terrible at having wealth tax discussions and bad at looking at other sorts of models around the world. Absolutely, I think that is true. So I think that will be a theme. That will have to be a theme. And the reason is, in the end, is that point about better future. Can we come up with a generational better future? Because if we don't come up with that, there is a real risk that you get to that kind of sense that society is stuck with where you start is where you finish. Because it's just flowing down. The people who are lucky enough to have parents and grandparents who have that money, it's just flowing down through those lines. I was saying before the talk that we've got Peter Turchin, who's written a book called End Times, coming to do a talk at King's next week or the week after. And his book is all about how we're getting to these tipping points in the concentration of wealth among a few, which he looks at very long-term trends over hundreds of years. And we're coming up to an era where all of those indicators that he looks at are pointing to a real proper societal collapse of proper going into revolution type things, because elite overproduction has happened, so people have been promised jobs, graduate jobs that don't exist, all of those types of things, but also wealth inequalities has got to the point where it's like the Gilded Age at the beginning of the 20th century, where huge concentrations of wealth, huge numbers of people being left behind mean that we tip into really disruptive, in that case, wars, but could be other things here. So that's not very hopeful. It's a response to quite a simple question. But the...
You'd put up inheritance tax on that. Works in your mouth?
I would. I mean, I probably would, but it's not... Sorry, I probably would, but only as part of a bigger package of how we look at wealth, because we put so much on inheritance tax. And then you'd have to engage with how are you dealing with social care and how that's provided. And I am a big believer in more shared risk on social care costs.
Right. I think we've got a microphone question. He's already had a question through the chair, but I think he's got another question. Just talk to it.
Yeah. I was interested in your comment about institutions to increase intergenerational contact. And it seems to me that educational institutions are the primary one to do this. I mean, I've been an academic at the university, including this one, for over 50 years. And all the thousands of students that I've taught are a different generation from me. So the fact that more and more people are going to university now seems to me critical in this sense, that it is encouraging, inevitably, institutional relationships between the generations.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
agree.
Anyone upstairs would like the microphone? Otherwise, I can press on. Put your hand up downstairs. If you, yes, we've got another question over there. Meanwhile, religion. Colin McEwen. Nothing was mentioned about religion or churches. Has whether this is impacted by the generational divides? He wonders whether. So the question, I think, is whether religion can still be one of the answers for intergenerational thinking, or stability, if you like. Would you like to?
Great question. It sort of links to the previous one about educational resources. So the reality is religion, cultural connection to Christianity in the UK has declined hugely and generationally. There's a whole chapter in the book on religion and generations because it is one of the most generational things. The era you were brought up in determines your cultural connection to Christianity in the UK as being the dominant religion. And it's just stepped down generation on generation, just in very flat lines. You kind of stay with it throughout your life. So Christianity has a huge issue in the UK. Globally, it's growing because population growth is in countries that have highly Christian populations. But in our country, it's a real challenge, and it is that linking to the question and the educational point. It really was one of those buttresses of intergenerational connection. So were community groups, so were trade unions. So were lots of those types of things that brought lots of different generations together, and a lot of them have gone now. So you're right that educational interconnection and building that better, so having schools not having areas that are completely separated, so having schools that are near or built into retirement areas is like a big theme within the US, for example. It also makes workplaces incredibly important for intergenerational connection for people, because it is one of the few where you do have big age spans, not past retirement age, unfortunately, so we need to build more than that. So yeah, we've had a lot of the things stripped away that were the more collective, and it's a trend towards an individualizing society where lots and lots of those sorts of interconnections have gone. So it is important. I mean, I would say that on the religion point, the changes are not as dramatic as you would expect, perhaps, in attendance at churches or other religious institutions, because we've become a much more diverse country in the meantime as well. So actually attendance has held up, and religion has moved from being what some of the religious scholars talk about as a conscript army, where everyone was effectively conscripted into some sort of religion, to a much more professional army now, where it's people who are still connected to religion are much more dedicated to it, partly because it's a much more diverse set of religions that have greater practice. So it can still be a real buttress for intergenerational connection, but it's a smaller population that are doing that.
We'll take one question with the microphone, and then two on the table, and we need to close.
Is there evidence that people's values or opinions, cultural, economic, social, become fixed, roughly fixed around a certain age or small age group, and is that age group shifting?
A really great question. Yeah, so I feel like all my answers are a bit of both, but That's the idea of formative years, is absolutely when you grew up has a bigger effect on you than things that would happen later in your life. So absolutely, there is an element of when you're born helps shape that starting point for cultural or economic attitudes or beliefs. But period effects, so going back to that kind of period and life cycle effects, still have a huge impact on us. We do change as we age and we go through different life stages. And then period effects of what's happening in fashions and norms in society overall also shifted. So if you look at things like attitudes to homosexuality, where generations brought up in very different circumstances where homosexuality was illegal in the UK, have changed their views hugely on the acceptability of homosexuality. It's not like they're set in that kind of era and don't change at all. Huge sort of cross-population rise in acceptability of homosexuality among all age groups. So it's a bit of both. And I sort of go back to whenever I'm thinking about what sort of change am I seeing here, I always try to think, is it cohort, period, or life cycle effects? And there's always a mix between those, but there's quite often a dominant one. So on some of those social attitudes, like homosexuality, how acceptable that is to people, that's much more a period effect than a cohort effect. The whole of society has pretty much moved on in their attitudes towards that. So I would always encourage you to think, what's the dominant effect from any change that you're seeing, or why we're explaining how society is today? Is that a result of cohort effects where generations have been very different and stayed different? Is it a result of, is my attitude changing because I'm at different stages in my life and trying to understand that? Or is there something going on in society as a period effect that's shifting it? It's incredible. I just use it in all sorts of things when I'm thinking about change.
Just going this question we can simplify if you give an answer A or B, right? Linda Sherwood wonders, she's talking about the media, to whose advantage is the media obsession with stoking the generational divide? She thinks it's just divide and rule, keep us all down. So if you think it's the media is the biggest problem with intergenerational stability, say media.
Yep.
Ian Watson says that he wonders whether politicians have segmented the one nation into separate generations to gain advantage by creating discontent between the age groups and so on and so forth. So if you think it's actually the politicians who are the main problem, the answer you give is politics.
Is that a subtle hint that I'm going on too long on my answers?
No, I just think it'd be nice to crystallise it.
Well, I mean, look, does the media own the politicians, or do the politicians own the media? I mean, it's like, that.
Sounds as both, is it?
It is, I'm sorry.
Right,
sorry.
okay.
But this is a really important point. It's a system that feeds off each other. So when I talk about the misperceptions, one feeds into the other. And plays on our biases on things like stoking culture wars. And you've got to think of it systemically, not about this is the one single cause or this is the one single cause. One feeds off the other, and then when I talk about the misperceptions, I say there's only two buckets of explanations. One is what we're told, and one is how we think. And we've got loads of biases and heuristics like confirmation bias, where we only want to hear things that we already agree with, those types of things. But the media and politicians know that. So they are playing on those two things. So you've got to think of the feedback loops and the whole system.
Finally, we've got a question here. I mean, my good friend Adrian Cartwright refers to the four things that you stated that we should try to achieve regarding intergenerational stability. I'd like to modify his question a little bit and ask you, if you were the Prime Minister running leading with the Intergenerational Stability Party, which would be the most important policy, you're a policy man, that you'd want to introduce to make things better?
Yep. So there is no intergenerational contract without fixing our broken housing market, is my final word.
Your applause says it all. I think it's been a wonderful evening with Professor Bobby Duffy, deeply informed through all his life's work. It's a lovely lecture, and I think we can get more out of that if we buy the book. We'll be over there at the end as you're leaving. And I thought in the Q&A he handled some pretty difficult questions. And I thought, do you know, I thought in a strange sort of way, and I said to him at the interval, I thought it's been rather an uplifting evening, and I hope we all feel rewarded by spending time with Professor Bobby Duffy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take it back.
Yeah.